One person wearing a Patriot prayer hat was shot and killed in Portland last night as pro-Trump demonstrators rallied in the city and clashed with counter-protesters. This happened days after the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the subsequent riots that followed have become such a major issue that Vice President Pence added it to his convention speech.
Last week, Joe Biden didn't say one word about the violence and chaos engulfing cities across this country. So let me be clear. The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha.
Biden did address Blake being shot in the back. There's a lot we don't know about that. And the 17-year-old charged with murdering two people during the riots in a video, and with MSNBC's Andrew Mitchell and CNN's Anderson Cooper.
By the way, I condemn violence in any form, whether it's looting or whatever it is. These guys are rooting for violence. That's what it's all about. To prove that you should be scared of Joe Biden, they're pointing to what's happening in Donald Trump's America.
I thought that Mike Pence might have something to say about the shooting of that young man in Kenosha, but instead, again, his focus was on the notion of violence.
Apparently, the chief suspect, a 17-year-old, is a supporter of President Trump, which is why I find it kind of surprising that the continued language about mobs in the street has been used.
I am shocked that the Democrats only now seem to be waking up to the fact that violence is a problem.
The Democrats have dropped the ball on this. They didn't bring it up during the DNC, and they thought, well, it's President Trump's America, and the unrest is going to be pinned on him.
Emily, perfectly fair for Trump and Pence to bring up the Kenosha riots. Fair to say that Joe Biden and the Democrats didn't discuss the earlier riots at their convention. But some journalists criticizing the Republicans, and Ben Carson was one exception, for not talking about the Jacob Blake shooting at their convention.
Those are fair points. I will say that to take a step back from the media's coverage, I think what is so difficult for reasonable, normal people to swallow is that kind of cherry picking and really utilization for political points the entire coverage. I just spent the last week in Portland and outside of it, and everyone there, just the normal, reasonable people, were sort of begging for just a reasonable coverage where it's okay to discuss inequities in America and what needs to be done about it, while also decrying violence of all forms and requesting peace on the streets without having the quote phrase law and order be construed as a racially tinged euphemism. So I think that's where the media right there is failing in terms of that cherry picking and really staccato machine gunning of all of those points for their benefit.
Right. We see cherry picking on both sides, of course. Philippe, many journalists are saying Joe Biden left himself vulnerable by having a 4-day convention where there was no talk at all about the riots that have consumed the country's attention and so much media coverage, but focusing only on racial injustice.
Yeah, well, I think to start, it's important to note that the timelines, the Democrats went a week earlier. So to whatever extent that this has taken on momentum and gotten larger or gotten more intense, that's something the Democrats couldn't foresee. But I think what's important to note here is exactly what Emily said. There's something here for everyone. And to the poll that I referenced this morning, after the George Floyd killing, you had 74% of Americans, which included a very high percentage of Republicans, who were not supportive of the president's handling of the incident. And in general, were noting that how racial justice in America is handled is unequal. After the Republican convention and after Jacob Blake, you have a situation where those numbers have gone way down. You have now, I think, 62% of Republicans and whites across all ideological bends, believing it. So unfortunately, to whatever extent there's a Republican strategy to stress law and order by pressing, even though it's law and order under a land that, as earlier noted, under President Trump, to whatever extent that's their key or one of their keys or one of their buttons they're going to push, it is working marginally. And that's unfortunate because it's a